The operation so secret, even commanders didn't know it happened 0 o'clock to 0:30. The officer opens the sealed envelope. Inside is a single sheet of paper. No letterhead. No signature. Just coordinates, a date, and 4 words. This conversation never happened. He's being ordered to assemble a team. 6 men. No records. No paperwork. No mission briefing to headquarters. They'll parachute into occupied Norway, sabotage a facility, and if they're captured, their own government will deny they exist. The officer looks at the man who delivered the envelope. Who authorized this? The man lights a cigarette. Nobody you can name. Nobody who'll take credit if it succeeds. Nobody who'll take blame if you all die. And if I refuse, then someone else reads this envelope. But you were chosen because you won't refuse. You understand that some operations are too important to officially exist. The officer nods. He burns the paper. The mission will happen. And if it succeeds, no one will ever know about it. 0:30 to 2 o'clock this happened. Multiple times. Throughout World War II, elite units conducted operations that were so classified, so sensitive, so politically explosive that they couldn't officially exist. No written orders. No after-action reports. No medals. Men would parachute behind enemy lines, complete impossible missions, and return to find that officially, they'd been on training exercises. Their own commanders didn't know where they'd really been. Some of these missions remained classified for 70 years. Some are still classified today. And some were so secret that the only evidence they happened at all is the testimony of the men who survived them. Welcome to Echoes of W2. I'm your host. Today we're going to tell you about black operations, the missions that were too secret to acknowledge, the elite units that officially didn't exist, the operations that even military commanders weren't told about. These weren't accidents. These weren't rogue operations. These were deliberate, authorized missions that were kept secret because revealing them would have caused diplomatic disasters, exposed intelligence sources, or violated international law. Your history teacher taught you about D-Day and the Battle of Midway. Today, you're going to learn about the operations that were too secret to make it into history books. 2 o'clock to 7 o'clock Operation Genocide. The mission, Churchill said, never happened. February 1943. Norway. A team of 6 Norwegian commandos parachutes into one of the most heavily defended facilities in occupied Europe, the Vemork heavy water plant. Heavy water is used in nuclear weapons research. The Germans are producing it at Vemork and shipping it to Germany for their atomic bomb program. Allied intelligence knows that if Germany develops nuclear weapons before the Allies do, the war is lost. The mission is simple in concept. Destroy the heavy water production facility, but it's impossible in execution. The plant is in a deep valley, surrounded by mountains, in the middle of winter. German guards patrol constantly. The facility is built into a cliff face, making it nearly impossible to approach without being seen. Previous attempts to attack the plant failed catastrophically. In November 1942, British commandos attempted to reach Vemork by glider. Both gliders crashed. The survivors were captured and executed. The Germans then reinforced security, making the facility even more heavily defended. But Churchill needs this facility destroyed. The British can't bomb it. The plant is too close to Norwegian civilians, and bombing isn't precise enough. A ground assault would require a large force that couldn't reach the facility without being detected. The only option is a small team of specially trained commandos. The problem: if this mission is discovered, if commandos are captured, Germany will claim Britain is conducting terrorist operations against civilian facilities. Norway, though occupied, is technically neutral. Britain operating commandos in Norway, without Norwegian government approval, could create diplomatic problems with other neutral nations. So the operation has to be completely deniable. The commandos will wear no uniforms, carry no identification, use weapons that can't be traced to Britain. If captured, the British government will deny any knowledge of them. 6 Norwegian commandos, trained by British Special Operations executives, so are chosen. They parachute into Norway in February 1943. They spend weeks hiking through mountains in blizzard conditions, reaching the facility. On the night of February 27th, they infiltrate Wehrmacht. They enter through a cable tunnel the Germans didn't consider defensible. They plant explosives on the heavy water production equipment. They escape before the bombs detonate. The explosion destroys Wehrmacht's capacity to produce heavy water. Germany's nuclear program is crippled. The commandos escape and eventually make it to Sweden. The mission is a complete success, but officially, it never happened. Churchill personally ordered that no records be kept, so destroyed all documentation of the operation. The commandos were told never to discuss it. When Norwegian officials asked Britain if they'd conducted operations on Norwegian soil, Britain denied it completely. The facility was bombed by American aircraft later in 1943 to explain the damage. The cover story was that only air raids had damaged Wehrmacht, not a commando raid. The truth didn't come out until 1948, 3 years after the war ended. Even then, full details remained classified until the 1990s. The commandos, who'd risked their lives for one of the war's most important sabotage missions, couldn't talk about it for 50 years. One of the commandos, Joachim Rumberg, was interviewed before his death in 2018. He was 99 years old. He said, "We were told the mission would save thousands of lives by preventing Germany from developing atomic weapons. We were also told that if we were caught, Britain would deny we existed. We accepted both. The mission mattered more than recognition." The ALSO's mission, kidnapping scientists, here's an operation that sounds like a movie plot, but was completely real. Allied commandos kidnapping German scientists before the Soviets could capture them. Late 1944. The war in Europe is clearly ending. Germany will be defeated. But now there's a new concern. What happens to German scientists? Specifically, scientists who know how to build rockets, jet engines, chemical weapons, and potentially atomic bombs. The Americans want them. The British want them. The Soviets definitely want them. Whoever captures these scientists first will have a massive advantage in the post-war world. So a secret operation is created. ALSO's. The mission is to locate German scientists and either capture them, or prevent the Soviets from capturing them. Sometimes this means rescuing scientists. Sometimes it means kidnapping them. And sometimes it means making sure they can't help anyone. The ALSO's teams were scientists and soldiers working together. They'd enter newly captured German territory, find research facilities and universities, identify key scientists, and secure them before Soviet forces arrived. This was politically explosive. America and the Soviet Union were supposed to be allies, but American forces were literally raising Soviet forces to capture German scientists. If the Soviets discovered this, it could have destroyed the alliance at a crucial moment. So ALSO's operations were completely classified. Even most Allied commanders didn't know about them. Units conducting ALSO's missions were told they were on intelligence gathering operations. Only the team leaders knew the real mission. One ALSO's team entered the German town of Hechingen in April 1945, just hours before Soviet forces were expected to arrive. They found a research facility where German nuclear scientists had been working. The team quickly identified the lead scientists, bundled them into vehicles, and drove west toward American lines. They made it out just as Soviet forces entered the town from the east. The Soviets searched the facility and found it empty. The key scientists were gone. Those scientists were taken to America, where many worked on U.S. nuclear and rocket programs. Werner Heisenberg, one of the scientists captured by ALSO's, became crucial to American understanding of German nuclear research. The ALSO's mission was so secret that it wasn't declassified until 1962, for 17 years after the war. The kidnapping of German scientists was completely hidden from the public. 7 o'clock to 12 o'clock Special Air Service. The unit that officially didn't exist. Let's talk about the SAS. Today, the British Special Air Service is famous. Elite Special Forces. known worldwide. But during World War II, the SAS officially didn't exist. The unit was created in 1941 by a British officer named David Stirling. His idea was simple. Small teams of highly trained soldiers could cause more damage than large conventional units. By striking behind enemy lines, the British military brass didn't believe this. They thought special forces were a waste of resources. But Stirling got permission for an experiment, a trial unit. Officially, it was called AL Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The brigade part was a lie. There was no brigade. It was about 60 men. The name was deception, making the Germans think the British had a much larger airborne unit than they actually did. AL Detachment began conducting raids in North Africa. Small teams would infiltrate German airfields and destroy aircraft with explosives. They'd hit supply depots, command posts, and communication lines. The raids were devastatingly effective. One 5-man team destroyed more German aircraft in a single night than entire RAF bomber squadrons had destroyed in weeks. But there was a problem. These operations were politically sensitive. The teams wore no uniforms, at least not regulation uniforms. They often wore enemy uniforms to infiltrate targets. They were essentially conducting terrorist operations behind enemy lines. Under the Geneva Conventions, soldiers in civilian clothes or enemy uniforms can be executed as spies. Britain didn't want to acknowledge that they were conducting operations that could get their soldiers executed if captured. So SAS operations were never officially recorded. Commanders in North Africa would be told that certain targets had been destroyed, but they weren't told how or by whom. The SAS was a ghost unit. Everyone knew they existed, but nobody could officially acknowledge them. This created bizarre situations. SAS soldiers would complete a mission, return to base, and find that there was no record of them having been gone. Officially, they'd been at base the entire time. Their mission never happened. One SAS soldier, Bob Bennett, later recalled, "We'd blow up 30 German planes, hike 50 miles through the desert, nearly die of thirst, and get back to base to find there was no official record of the mission. It was frustrating. We were doing important work and getting no recognition. But we understood why. If Germany captured one of us and Britain had to acknowledge we were wearing German uniforms, it would be a propaganda disaster." The SAS conducted over 200 operations during the North Africa campaign. Officially, none of them happened. All those operations were attributed to other units, or to accidents, or simply not mentioned in official records at all. It wasn't until 1946, after the war ended, that the British government officially acknowledged the SAS existed. Even then, most of their operations remained classified. Operation Jedburgh. Training the resistance. Here's one most people have never heard of. Operation Jedburgh. Allied Special Forces teams parachuted into occupied France to train and lead resistance fighters. But these operations were so secret that even the resistance members didn't know the teams were coming. The teams, called Jeds, consisted of 3 men, 1 American, 1 British, and 1 French. They'd parachute into France, make contact with local resistance groups, and train them for combat operations coordinated with the D-Day invasion. The problem: this was technically a violation of French sovereignty. France was occupied, but it still technically had a government, the Vichy regime. That government was collaborating with Germany, but it was still the legal French government recognized by some nations. If Britain and America openly sent soldiers into France to train armed resistance, it would be acknowledging that they didn't recognize Vichy authority. This could complicate relations with neutral nations who still recognized Vichy France. So Jedburgh operations were completely classified. The teams wore no official uniforms. They carried no identification linking them to Allied forces. If captured, their governments would deny they existed. Between June and December 1944, 93 Jedburgh teams parachuted into occupied France. They trained thousands of resistance fighters. They coordinated sabotage operations that destroyed German communications and delayed reinforcements from reaching Normandy after D-Day. One Jedburgh team, operating in southern France, organized a resistance force that destroyed 31 locomotives, cut 16 railway lines, and ambushed numerous German convoys. The three-man team multiplied their effect by training hundreds of resistance fighters, but officially, none of this happened. Allied headquarters in London had no records of Jedburgh operations. The teams didn't file reports. They simply disappeared into occupied France and did their work. After the liberation of France, Jedburgh teams just showed up in Paris. Allied commanders would ask where they'd been, what they'd been doing. The Jeds couldn't say. Their operations were classified. Officially, they'd been on training exercises in England the entire time. One American Jedburgh officer, William Colby, later became director of the CIA. In his memoirs, he wrote about Jedburgh operations. He said they taught him that the most effective operations are the ones nobody knows about. That being unacknowledged gives you freedom to take risks that official operations can't take. 12 o'clock to 17 o'clock, the long-range desert group. Nobody knew where they were while the SAS was blowing up German aircraft. Another secret unit was operating in the North African desert. The Long-Range Desert Group, or LRDG. The LRDG's mission was reconnaissance. Drive deep into the Sahara Desert, hundreds of miles behind German lines, and gather intelligence. But these weren't ordinary reconnaissance missions. LRDG patrols would disappear into the desert for weeks at a time. Even their own commanders didn't know where they were. They operated completely independently, with no radio contact, no supply lines, no support. They'd navigate using sun compasses and dead reckoning. They'd live off supplies they carried in their trucks. They'd hide during the day and drive at night. And they'd penetrate so far behind German lines that even German forces were surprised. When they encountered them, the LRDG discovered the routes German supply convoys used. They found German airfields that Allied intelligence didn't know existed. They mapped terrain that no maps showed. But they also conducted operations that officially never happened. They'd ambush German convoys. They'd raid supply depots. They'd sabotage equipment. Then they'd vanish back into the desert before German forces could respond. German intelligence knew something was operating behind their lines. They'd find destroyed convoys, sabotaged facilities, dead soldiers. But they couldn't figure out who was responsible. The attacks were too deep behind the front lines for conventional forces. The attackers left no traces, no bodies, no evidence. German reports from North Africa mentioned phantom attackers and desert ghosts. They knew they were being hit by someone, but they couldn't identify who. That's because LRDG operations were never recorded. When an LRDG patrol returned from a mission, they'd be debriefed verbally. No written reports. No documentation. Officially, they'd been conducting reconnaissance. If they happened to blow up some German trucks along the way, well, that wasn't officially reported. One LRDG patrol conducted a 1,500-mile journey through the Sahara, navigating entirely by sun compass, living on minimal water and rations, and gathering intelligence on German positions. They were gone for 5 weeks. During that time, their own commanders assumed they were probably dead. When they returned, having traveled further behind enemy lines than any Allied unit, having mapped routes German forces didn't know existed, they couldn't officially report what they'd done. The mission was too sensitive. If Germany learned how far behind their lines Allied forces could operate, they'd completely change their defensive strategy. So the patrol was simply noted as returned from reconnaissance mission. All the intelligence they gathered, all the Germans they'd killed, all the equipment they'd destroyed, none of it was officially recorded. See Special Unit. Australia's secret commandos. Now let's talk about one of the most secret units of the entire war. See Special Unit. Australia's equivalent to the British SAS. See Special Unit was created in 1940 to conduct sabotage and intelligence operations in the Pacific. But these operations were so politically sensitive that the unit's existence was kept secret, not just from the enemy, but from most of the Australian government. Why? because many Z special operations involved entering neutral or technically friendly territory without permission. They'd infiltrate places where Australia officially had no military presence, and if operations were discovered, the Australian government needed to be able to deny any knowledge. One of Z Special's most famous operations was Operation Jaywick. In September 1943, 14 men travelled 2,000 miles from Australia to Singapore harbour in a captured Japanese fishing boat. They infiltrated the harbour, placed limpet mines on Japanese ships, and escaped. 7 Japanese ships were sunk or damaged. The Japanese had no idea how it happened. They assumed it was sabotage by local resistance, not Australian commandos who travelled 2,000 miles to attack them. Operation Jaywick was so secret that even after it succeeded, the Australian government didn't acknowledge it. The men who conducted the operation couldn't tell anyone where they'd been. Their families thought they'd been on training exercises. Z Special Unit conducted dozens of operations throughout the Pacific. They infiltrated Japanese-occupied islands, gathered intelligence, trained resistance fighters, and conducted sabotage. And almost none of it was officially recorded. After the war, Australia destroyed most Z Special Unit records. The operations were considered too sensitive to preserve. Only personal accounts from surviving members give us any idea what they did. 17 o'clock to 20 o'clock. Why the secrecy mattered, you might be wondering. Why all the secrecy? Why couldn't these operations be acknowledged? Several reasons. First, plausible deniability. If operations violated international law or neutral territory, governments needed to be able to deny responsibility. Second, protecting methods. If Germany learned how Allied commandos infiltrated their facilities, they'd improve security everywhere. Keeping operations secret meant the techniques could be used again. Third, protecting lives. Many secret operations relied on local resistance fighters or intelligence sources. If operations were publicly acknowledged, it could expose those sources to German retaliation. And fourth, post-war politics. Some operations involved actions that would be problematic to acknowledge after the war ended. Kidnapping scientists, assassinating targets, operating in neutral territory. These things were necessary during the war, but politically explosive afterward. So operations stayed classified. For decades. Some for generations. Some are still classified today. The men who conducted these operations lived with that secrecy. They couldn't tell their families where they'd been or what they'd done. They couldn't receive recognition for their achievements. They had to watch other units receive credit for victories they'd helped achieve. One SAS veteran said, "The hardest part wasn't the missions. It was coming home and not being able to tell anyone. Your family asks where you've been. You have to lie. Your friends ask what you did in the war. You have to be vague. You carry these experiences, these memories, and you can't share them with anyone." Many of these veterans died before their operations were declassified. They went to their graves without ever being able to talk publicly about what they'd done. But their operations mattered. The heavy water plant at Wehrmacht destroyed. German scientists captured before the Soviets reached them. Resistance networks trained and armed. Intelligence gathered from deep behind enemy lines. These secret operations didn't win the war by themselves, but they contributed in ways that official military operations couldn't. They took risks that conventional forces couldn't take. They operated in places where official military presence was impossible, and they did it knowing they'd never get credit, knowing that officially their missions never happened, knowing that the operations they risked their lives for would be erased from history. This is Echoes of W2. Today you learned about operations so secret that even commanders didn't know about them. Black operations. Elite units that officially didn't exist. Missions that were erased from official records. Your history teacher taught you about the battles everyone knows about. Today you learned about the operations that remained secret for decades. The missions that couldn't be acknowledged. The units that operated in the shadows. These operations happened. These men existed. These missions mattered. But 4 years, officially, none of it was real. Now you know. Now you know that some of the war's most important operations were the ones that nobody was supposed to know about. The ones that even 70 years later, we're still learning about. Because the most effective operations are the ones that officially never happened.